Welcome back to FallingFoxGaming, everybody. I'm your host Blaine, and today we're going to be continuing with our Kenshi Beginner's Guide for 2021. In part 1, we covered character creation, starting scenarios, and most of the basic UI. In this video, we're going to finish up talking about the UI, we're going to get into the character stats, and then at the end of the video, we're going to have some general tips for you guys before getting into the big part of the game, where I show you guys how to do kind of everything in the early game. That'll be part 3, so watch out for that. So let's get started with talking about the rest of the UI. The floor indicator icon allows you to see which floor of a building you're looking at. If you have it set to floor 0, that will show you the ground floor of a building once you have someone inside the building. If you click the up arrow, it will progress to further and further floors, and then if you click down, it'll obviously lower the floor. This allows you to check out different floors once you have a character inside of a building. If you don't have a character inside of the building, it doesn't matter what level you have it set to, you'll only see the outside of the building. To the right of the floor indicator icon is the speed control system for Kenshi. The game has 4 speed settings. You can either pause the game, have the game run at normal speed, increase the speed, or increase the speed greatly. Now generally you'll want to play the game on normal speed, but you'll often pause it during combat or when you're trying to make decisions that you don't want to make hastily. You can increase the speed depending on the task you're doing, if you're doing some mining or if you're just traveling long distances, but just be aware that when you're playing at higher speeds, it gives you less time to react to threats throughout the world. Just to the right of the speed controls is the displayer that shows how much money you have, the day, and the current time. Now I have noticed that the time does seem to be a little bit buggy in terms of the day and night cycles. Sometimes it doesn't get dark until basically 1 o'clock in the morning, and other times it's still dark or late in the day. So in all honesty, I don't rely fully on the time clock to determine day and night. I just keep an eye on what it looks like in the game world. So just be warned that sometimes the clock seems to be a little bit out of sync with the game world. The final icon in the yellow box here is the button to open and close the build menu. We're not going to talk about it in this video. There's a lot to talk about in detail for it, so I'll cover it in the next video. Everything in the orange box can be thought of somewhat like an individual character's options. The block, hold, passive, jobs, range, taunt, and sneak, along with the bottom left icon with the arrows with the character running, indicates options that you can toggle for each individual character in your party. The rescue, medic, and prospect buttons are all actions you can have a particular character or selected characters do. I'm going to cover them very briefly. They really don't need much explaining, but I am going to kind of give you an idea of how to use them in the game. So that way, those of you that don't know what they are can use them effectively without having to worry about the minute details. The block option sets your character to a purely defensive stance, where they gain a bonus to their blocking ability, but they will not attack. The bonus you actually get from the block toggle option is really not all that great. And honestly, the only time I've ever really used it is when I've had multiple people in a fight and one person is just outnumbered, and I just set them to block so that way they can hold out a little bit longer until their other teammates can get to them. More often than not, you're actually better off just leaving this option off and letting your characters try and fight, and if they get knocked down, let them get knocked down and then have them get back up to fight again. The hold option prevents the AI from taking control of your characters and having them chase down enemies or run over to new combat when it's nearby. This is primarily used to keep your people in very specific formations, or to keep archers in a specific location so that they can fire without hitting friendly targets. It's a very micromanaged button, as you have to control each one of your people individually when this option is toggled, and honestly I do like using it, but for a lot of people it's not a very good option, especially when you don't know the game too well. It's better to let the AI have your people run around and attack targets they see fit. If you have the passive option toggled, it simply means that your characters will not attack, even if they're being attacked themselves. Be very, very careful with this option. If you forget that it's on, your characters will let themselves get killed. Only turn it on when your characters are generally in a safe area, or if you really, really do not want them engaged in a fight. The jobs toggle option is one of the more complex things in Kenshi. This button allows the AI to control your character without your input. If it's toggled off, your character will simply just stand there and defend themselves, and that's just about it. However, if you have this toggled on, then your character will do any of the things from the AI menu that we talked about in the last video, or they will do jobs that you have assigned to them. Now, we haven't actually covered jobs as a game mechanic yet, so I'm not going to go into that too deeply yet, but know that your character won't do any jobs unless you have this option toggled on. You can leave a job in their queued actions without them actually doing the job just by unselecting this option. So for instance, if you have someone on medic and mining, if you toggle this off, they won't do either of those jobs until you toggle it back on. It's a nice way to keep your characters with say a profession, but without actually having them currently doing it. The ranged button simply means whether or not your character will prioritize using their ranged weapon over their melee weapon. If you have this turned on, your character will use their ranged weapon until they are attacked in melee, at which point they'll draw their secondary weapon if they have one. If you have a character that has a ranged weapon and a secondary weapon, if you want them to use their melee weapon in their secondary slot instead of their ranged weapon, just toggle this option off and they will draw that one instead of using their primary ranged weapon. As with many things in Kenshi, this button can be buggy and sometimes they don't switch their weapons properly. So make sure when you're toggling this on and off that you're watching your characters to make sure they're switching their weapons properly. Taunt is another self-explanatory button. It simply means that the selected character is attempting to draw as much attention from the enemies as possible, meaning they attack him instead of your allies. This is really useful if you have a well-armored person or a well-trained person with a group that's not very well trained. They will take the aggression from the enemies and allow the lesser trained people to attack from behind or the side or run away. The final toggle button is the sneak option. Now this is something that needs a little bit of explaining and we'll cover sneak when we actually get to the stats, but basically this is the button that you click to make your character go in and out of stealth mode. I do highly recommend you go into your key configuration and hotkey this to something really close to your basic movement keys. I have mine set to the tilde key so that way I can quickly go in and out of stealth if you need to, and it's saved me multiple times, so it's something I highly recommend you do. The stick figure icon with the two arrows next to it is a toggleable option for each character that determines their movement type, anything from walking to running to traveling as a group with the slowest team member, and so on and so forth. This option, I highly recommend you just make it so all of them have the icon set to movement as a group. That way everyone in the group that you've selected travels at the same speed as the slowest person in your group. That way you don't outpace each other. The rescue and medic buttons are actions you can have your selected characters perform. The rescue button will make it so anybody selected will pick up any and all fallen teammates or allies if you're allied with another faction and you're near a downed person. The medic similarly will assign the medic job, which means they'll use their first aid kits to heal them up, or robotic kits if it's a skeleton. And lastly, the prospect button still does not work properly, so I'm not even joking. Just ignore this button, pretend it doesn't exist. The next part of our guide is going to be talking about the stats of your characters. Now, I warn you that this is going to be a very long and dry section as there's a lot of stats to go over and a lot of just details that don't necessarily matter so much to your day-to-day gameplay. So I do invite you to skip ahead to the general information and tips that I'm going to give afterwards until you play the game a little bit and actually care what the stats are. But the stats guide is going to be here just for those that actually want to know about it. So here we go. You can open up your stat menu by either clicking the stat button or by pushing C as the default hotkey, and it will bring you to this menu here. Normally this menu will just be overlaid over your general game, but I'm going to block out the back screen so I can show you information a little bit clearer. The first thing we're going to talk about in the stats menu is the attributes, because every other skill is affected by the attributes. The strength attribute is one of the most important things in the game. It affects your max carry weight and the damage you do with several weapons, along with martial arts damage. The primary ways to increase the strength attribute is by using heavy weapons, carrying heavy loads, and by carrying other people, either allies or fallen people. If you want to use blunt weapons, heavy weapons, or any of the hacking type blade weapons, or unarmed, it's very important that you have a very high strength attribute, so practice training it pretty early on. I will discuss easy ways to train this skill up in the tips section, so look forward to that. In terms of importance, toughness is very similar to strength. Toughness is your general ability to resist damage, deal out some martial arts damage, and your ability to resist dying in the game world. Toughness can be trained by getting yourself back up after you've been knocked down, instead of using the stealth option to play dead. It also trains up faster if you're not wearing armor, and when you take more damage from a single hit. It's kind of a complex skill in how it actually trains up, but generally the more you're getting beaten up, the more the skill is increasing. And the tougher enemies you face, again, the faster the skill will go up. Generally you want to have as high toughness as possible because it will mean that you will resist dying when you're knocked out and if you go into a coma. Dexterity is very straightforward. It simply affects how quickly you can attack and block and increases the damage of your bladed weapons such as swords. It will also increase your rate of fire and your reload speed of your ranged weapons, and the only real way to train this skill up is by using light weapons. So the best way to train the skill up is to use a light crossbow and a light offhanded weapon and then just have it go up over time. Sorry, no shortcuts. The final attribute is perception, and it really only affects ranged weapons. It increases your accuracy, your range, your ability to shoot moving targets, and it's trained up using turrets and other ranged weapons. If you want to train this, I highly suggest you start off with a really weak crossbow and equip it to your characters, because you are going to shoot your friendly targets quite often while using this bow. You will eventually be able to stop shooting your friendly targets, but that's going to take quite a while, and I wouldn't expect it to happen anytime soon. I'll explain this more in the tips section coming up. In the interest of not making this a 2-hour long video, I'm going to actually summarize the rest of the skills in a few different categories to make things easy for new players to understand. If you scroll over any of these individual skills within the game menu, you can actually see exactly what it does, but most of the time knowing the precise definition does not really help you. The summaries I'll provide here will give you more than enough information to let you know how to train the skill and what you're exactly using it for. When it comes to weapons, Kenshi has a very simple system. All weapons have a specific category that they belong to. Katanas, sabers, hackers, heavy weapons, blunt, and pole arms. Not including martial arts here because it's a little bit different. All of these skills are improved the exact same way, by attacking with that particular type of weapon. And the more you use a weapon, eventually the more damage you'll do with it. It's that simple. Each type of weapon has some pros and cons about it, but generally you can use just about any weapon and still be effective with it so long as you train the skill up a little bit. While there are differences between each of the types of weapons, I generally recommend that you just play with a weapon that you think looks cool because honestly, at the end of the day, that's more important than how it performs in combat. Like I said, all weapons can be good, so don't worry too much about the specifics behind a weapon, just make sure you enjoy what it looks like. Ranged combat in Kenshi is actually quite a bit different than the melee combat. For starters, there is friendly fire for ranged weapons, so be very aware of that. You will shoot your own teammates quite frequently in the beginning. Along with that, a target cannot dodge or block an arrow, so anytime you shoot at a target, if you hit them, you will actually hit them. There's nothing they can do about it. That being said, your skills start off so poor that you'll generally miss frequently. As you level up either your crossbow skill or your turret skill, you'll begin to hit more and more frequently. Improving your accuracy, aiming speed, and reloading speed is actually the primary reason why you want to level up your range skills. The damage you gain from increasing your skills is very minimal, and generally the crossbows in the game do a lot more damage than the melee weapons, so you won't see too big of an increase by leveling up your skills, but you will see a slight increase. The final and most important part of the range skill tree is the precision shooting skill. The precision shooting skill is what determines whether or not friendly fire takes effect. Once you have this skill high enough, you'll no longer hit your friends, but in the beginning you're going to be hitting your friends a lot, so it's best to give your people very weak crossbows and weak arrows in the beginning, so that way you're not hurting your people too much when you're hitting them. So generally, crossbows are very weak in the early game, but as you get to the mid to late game, they start becoming extremely powerful, to the point where you can take down entire groups before they even get close to you. Now that we've talked about the weapon skills, let's talk about the combat skills. It's separated into two categories, and it's determined by whether or not you have a weapon equipped. If you have a weapon equipped, you will be using the melee attack and melee defense skills. If you do not have a weapon equipped, you'll be using the martial arts and the dodge skills. The way these skills work is that they go up respectively while you're using a weapon or while you're not using a weapon in combat. Your melee attack and melee defense will go up if you're using a melee weapon, and your martial arts skill and your dodge skill will go up if you're not using any kind of weapon. As you increase melee attack, you'll land hits more frequently, you'll increase how fast you attack, and you'll generally wield your weapon a little bit better in combat. Melee defense will increase your chance to block an incoming attack, and it will increase how quickly you actually do the block so you can get back to attacking yourself. When it comes to martial arts, there's a couple things you need to know. First of all, if you're using martial arts, you actually take damage when you're striking enemies. This is because as a fleshy human, you don't have any kind of armor on your fists. Once you get your martial arts skill high enough, you will eventually stop taking damage from that. Unless you're a skeleton, which at that point you don't take any damage from using martial arts one way or another. Another cool thing about the martial arts skill, as you increase the skill, you'll actually learn some new moves which actually do different things in combat, such as knocking people over a little more frequently or stunning them. Now, if you don't have a weapon equipped, instead of using melee defense to block, you'll actually just attempt to evade attacks altogether. Now, this is actually better than blocking because when you block, you can still take some damage depending on the enemy. If you dodge, you outright avoid the attack altogether. The one big downside to dodge versus melee defense is that with evading attacks, you can actually get stuck in what's called dodge locked. You can actually get to the point where you're so good at dodging that you avoid every attack around you, but that leaves you no time to attack yourself, which means you could actually go in combat and never be able to defeat an enemy because you're never attacking. The only way to really fix this is to simply get a mod for it. There's a couple of them out there, and I recommend you check them out. The thievery and athletics skills really don't need too much explanation. The information I have right here on the screen is all you really need to know about them. Stealth determines how easy it is to remain undetected and increases your disguise effectiveness. Lockpicking determines how quickly and how effectively you could pick locks. Thievery increases your chance of stealing items. And assassination determines how successful you are at knocking someone out. Athletics is simply how fast you run, and swimming is how fast you swim. When it comes to the tips and tricks section, I will explain how each one of these skills are used in more detail, so don't worry about the details yet. When it comes to the trade and science skills, they all function the same. The higher you have the skill, the faster you are at the action that you're assigned. The medic and robotic skills also increase the efficiency of using first aid kits and skeleton repair kits. The higher you have the skill, the less of the kits you use as you use them. The higher you have your engineering skill, the quicker you can build structures and repair them, and then the higher your labor skill, it improves how quickly you can mine and how quickly you can process goods. The science skill determines how quickly you can research new technology, and technically it's supposed to determine your skill at prospecting, but as I've said before, the prospecting does not work, so don't worry about that. The weapons, armor, and crossbow smithing skills determine how quickly you can actually build items and the quality of the crafted items at the various stations. The farming skill increases the speed of your farming and improves the yield of each of your crops. The cooking skill improves the speed of your brewing and cooking. So as I've said before, Kenshi's skills are pretty self-explanatory, and you really don't need to know the details of them. Whatever skills you're using while you're playing will level themselves up, and you'll just get better at everything that you're doing. All that being said, let's get to the general tips. The next video is going to cover all the basics of playing Kenshi and some general information of what you can do in the early game to make the rest of your game more enjoyable, but for the final section of this video, I want to leave you guys with a couple of general tips that will make everything else easier for you just in case you don't know about it. First and foremost is learning some of the hotkeys. The spacebar is one of the best hotkeys as it pauses the game or returns the game back to the speed which you had it set for, along with using the F1, F2, and F3 keys to change the game speed without having to actually click the button with your mouse. You can also hold the right mouse button down whenever you can interact with an object or a person to see a list of all the options you can do. You're not just limited to right clicking and just leaving out whatever happens. Most of the time you can do multiple things to an object or a person, so it's always worth holding down the right mouse button to see what you can all do. The last tip is going to be more of general advice for those that are just starting Kenshi. Kenshi is an open world sandbox game with very, very little guidance. It's not a game for everybody, and it can be very hard for a lot of people to get into. There is also a pretty steep learning curve because there's so many different options and different ways to play the game that you may jump in the game expecting one thing and finding yourself not enjoying that, but not knowing that there are other options and other ways to play the game. So my biggest suggestion for most people is to play the game for an hour or two. If you're not really having that good of a time with that character, start a new game with something different. The more you start new games, the more you can see the different starting locations, the more you can try different role plays, and in general, if you are self-governing and self-guiding, you can have an unlimited amount of fun in this game. I have over 1,000 hours, and I continuously still have a great time every time I play because I go into the game to make my own adventures, and you kind of have to do the same thing. If that's not your style of game, this may not be the game for you, and I'm sorry to say that. It's pretty blunt, but that's the way it is. If you're somebody that needs somebody to hold your hand to play the game, you'll probably not have a good time. And if you've played the game for about 20 hours and you're still not really enjoying it, it's probably just never going to click for you. But that's going to do it for this video. I know it was a fairly dry video, mostly statistics and stuff like that, which are not exactly everybody's bread and butter, but they're good things to know for those that want the information. Our next video is going to cover starting the game, things you can do in the early game and the mid game to make everything more enjoyable for yourself, and several different playstyles that you can do if you're just struggling to come up with a way to play Kenshi enjoyably. Thank you guys for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed this. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe, and I will see you next time.